Moving on to the next slide, we have the evolution of compliance. So again, along with the evolution in legislation and in our culture, our cultural shift, there's also been an ongoing change as to how people are complying with this. So I want to cover kind of three main themes. The first one is manual to automated. So traditionally, you would have seen a call-in system. You would have had an employee if they were going to be working alone, they would call their supervisor or manager, occasionally perhaps a third party, and communicate the length of their shift. And then that employee would be responsible for checking in periodically according to that company's procedure. So that might be every 2 hours, every 4 hours, etc. This really provides limited and outdated information. So the only information you have is whether or not that employee is okay or they're not okay. And that is really based on the last time that they checked in. So that could be, 2 hours ago. So while it's outdated, it is also still the backbone of most lone worker programs, and for good reason. It does act as a fail-safe. So if nothing else, if there's no technology involved, if there's no visibility of the employee, if they don't check in when they're supposed to, you will be alerted to that and will follow up with the employee. So it still should be a part of every lone worker program. What we see today in a more automated world is a number of things. So number one, improved communication. It's not just a phone call nowadays. You have texting, you have smartphone apps, satellite devices, email. There's a ton of communication methods that make it much easier for an employee and someone who's monitoring them to stay in touch. We also have more context and real-time visibility. So if something does happen, it's not just a missed check-in, and then we have to find out, where that employee is and what happened. We can, through technology, know that that employee is perhaps traveling at a certain speed down the highway and is okay. Or we can know if it's, for example, a man-down technology that that employee isn't okay, and we need to go to that location, which we can see via GPS, and get to them right away. So a lot of enhancements there. It's also moved to proactive versus reactive. So rather than relying on a missed check-in to notify us of a potential problem, we have technology that can notify us ahead of time. So whether that be the man-down technology or an employee hitting a panic alarm on their app, or a in-vehicle monitoring device that can indicate a crash. There's any number of ways to proactively notify. And we also have multiple alerts now, so we can have different unique procedures. So if someone hits a panic alarm, that would obviously have a more immediate response than someone who hit an assistance button and asked for assistance with a flat tire. So let's tackle the second middle portion there, in-house versus third-party monitoring. Again, traditionally it was mostly monitoring of lone workers was traditionally done by internal supervisors and managers. Now that, while of course they're doing right by their employees, there are some limitations on that. A manager or a supervisor has many other priorities during their day besides monitoring employees. That just makes it so easy for something to slip through the cracks. So with limited resources, there's also the burden of liability. With the legislation now holding individuals criminally responsible, if a manager simply misses an alert due to a meeting or something like that, and something were to happen, they can be held criminally liable, and managers and supervisors really don't want that on their shoulders. So when you look at third-party monitoring, you have 24/7 dedicated personnel. So no matter what time of day someone is entering a lone worker situation, you're not relying on a supervisor to wake up at 3 a.m. and respond to an alert. There's someone there ready and waiting. It's often cheaper. You don't have to worry about maintaining internal staff and infrastructure to do the monitoring. And it makes it easier to respond to alerts because you have all information in one source. So if you think about a supervisor, if something goes wrong, they have to look in the back end of a GPS portal. They have to potentially look in their HRMS system for information on the employee, go to a safe work form. There could be a ton of different information sources that they're having to go to. Whereas with the third-party monitor, it's all there in one place, and you have a huge team of individuals that can all divide and conquer. The last item that we have there is prescriptive procedures versus a risk-based program. So we're going to dive into this in a little more detail in the next slide, but to kind of talk broadly about it, what we saw traditionally was kind of one sweeping standard to lone worker monitoring that a company would employ across all of their operations, all of their regions. And while this is a great start, those procedures were often a bit cumbersome because you had to look at all of the employees and all the potential risks they would face, lump it all into one procedure, and it allowed for really little flexibility and oftentimes a lack of a hazard assessment. Nowadays, as we're moving to the more risk-based approach, we have employees engaged in the process. There's often a hazard assessment involved right off the bat that the employee performs themselves. They take into consideration tasks, location, communication risks. Well, you can have kind of a standard that applies to all of your employees. You can allow for flexibility with different business units and operating regions. So it often results in a more simplified procedure and higher user adoption.